From here on, I want to break this installation into two pieces, the dash and the interior. I am going to use, and you see I have them mocked up over here, the ultra detail plastic doors. These, once completed, will simply slot into place right here. You can see there's basically a little recess, at which point they will be glued in place. The door panel does have corresponding hardware, however, but there are components on here like the window cranks, the door handles, that will need to be installed here. However, I'm going to have them as different colors, so I don't need to paint them together. There are some areas that you may want to sand down just to increase some detail. Also, these are printed in this orientation, so usually the fronts are very, very nice, but along the grain you may get some weird painting areas, so it's definitely advised to clean these areas up. I'm going to use some 1500 grit sandpaper. You can kind of see what's happening here. These are the different layers that are being sanded. And with this 1500 grit, I would like to just smooth this out. If you go with the SLS nylon, this is going to be a lot more work. However, you're going to have a lot less of this cross-sectional grain to deal with. But again, that particular material choice will compromise the amount of detail that you get. For the interior, I'm going to do no prep whatsoever. First off, the colors that I'm going to use are going to be matte anyway. Also, the texture that does reside here, I think will add to the fact that this is supposed to be upholstery. There are some areas that the resolution is a little too low, so maybe on second thought, I might want to run some fairly rough sandpaper over that. And remember that going along the grain isn't really going to help. You want to go against it. I just want to break it down a little bit. In fact, you can see the sandpaper is still remarkably clean. I'm also going to paint over the shift boots because I'm going to go back later and paint them by hand. Remember, there are holes here, so you do want to make sure that they're clean. I am going to go ahead and primer these with the paint that I plan on using for the interior. Since it's nylon, it really doesn't need any kind of adhesion promoter. This stuff works really well, it just sucks it all up. For the door panels, I am going to use Tamiya Fine Primer and then paint them with a corresponding color to match the interior. The dash also needs to match the door panels. In the 1980s, you usually would get these monotone interiors. So the door panels, the dash are going to be the same colors. I'm going to take a little bit of this 240 and just go again against the grain here. The ultra detail plastic that Shapeways offers is awesome to sand. Maybe actually 400 might be a little better. I might just go over with 400 when I'm done with this. We're slowly smoothing out these lines here from the 3D printing process. I'm going to do that over the entire dash and I'll be right back. I've gone over the entire thing with the 400 grit after I finished the 240, and now I'm just polishing up a little bit with the 1500. Just be extremely careful that you don't put a lot of load on a member like this because you will snap it. The ultra detail plastic has exceptional detail, but it is not known for its structural integrity. The Tamiya Fine Primer will be used on this. While some of the larger parts are drying, I did want to focus on the smaller pieces like the steering wheel, the steering column, the main dash bezel. This is the gauge bezel, the gauges themselves, the radio part here, and all of the other little pieces. There's also two more of these smaller pieces here, but they're kind of difficult to not lose, so I'm just going to focus on these guys here. The first thing I want to note about these two parts is that they are highly, highly detailed. You can see them here. The ones that you're going to get are a little bit higher quality. These are off of my printer at the office, and it just doesn't get to the kind of level that the ultra detailed from Shapeways gets. The thing is, the details on this, although embossed, they are still very, very slight. So when painting these, you either have to do a very, very light pass with a spray can or use an airbrush. When brush painting, you've got to be extraordinarily careful and dilute the paint, otherwise you're going to mute out all these details. Less important on this guy, but much more important on the smaller bezel here. You also want to keep all the paint, especially if you're brush painting, out of these mating faces. There's very, very little gap. So I think with a airbrush or a spray can, it's going to be pretty easy to not focus your efforts on these areas here. The steering wheel is a little bit easier because even though it's fairly small, this particular wheel usually has a black leather wrapped border. The horn button is right here. You've also got your tumbler for the steering column. This is snipped off and slotted right there. This is for your turn signal. And if you got the automatic version, you would have an indentation here for the automatic shifter right there. Make sure these holes are cleaned out. These were completely filled with SLS nylon dust, and you do not want to get it stuck trying to push it in here like so. You want to make sure that it slots in very easily. When it's in, you can put a little bit of glue, and also just make sure that this boss will fit in here nicely. Do not push it because the ultra detail plastic is relatively weak in comparison to the nylon. Also make sure that it is in the proper orientation, that the tumbler is on top. You also, of course, have to wait to put all these things together until your bezel's together, otherwise it won't slot in. I'm going to primer these now with the Tamiya white surface primer, and then I'm going to paint it probably black and then do some wood graining on these front faces, which is going to work awesome because of the texture that already resides here. Same thing over here. I'll give it a very, very light priming. For this part here, this is the gauge bezel. I'm going to make sure that these are painted a matte black. When it comes to these parts, and again, everything that you see here is going to be clear, except for the wheel, unless you go with nylon, then this will be nylon. It'll be white. Otherwise, it'll be clear if you go with the ultra detail plastic. These only come in clear because they're designed to be illuminated. My plan to paint these is to first put a Q-tip in here. I could use an LED, but I think this actually holds it in place a little nicer. Put a Q-tip in there, paint it silver. Then when the silver is dry, I'll paint it a matte black. And the reason for the silver is going to help in reflection. Same with the radial bezel here. We'll just stuff that in. As you can see here, everything has been painted. It wasn't too difficult. I shot the entire thing in the seat color. These are all interior paints that I've used to restore my full-size car, so I just picked those. And then I went with a little bit of a darker color for the carpet. I could not wait to take off the window crank because it looked adorable. And I'm just going to put it on right here. Look at that. That's the cutest thing I've ever seen. These will then be flush cut at the rear. Then, of course, we do have this piece here, which is the door handle. Now, before I press this in, which is going to go right in here, I'm going to paint this area right here a matte black because on the real car, it is a rubber gasket. We've got the center dash and the actual dash. When it comes to detailing some of these dash pieces, please understand that there's a lot of variations of the interior, different trim levels. Therefore, what I'm going to do may not be what you want. I want to go kind of high end with the wood grain and all that stuff, but you may want to do like a base model truck. So that's, again, it's all up to you. I have designed all of these pieces with kind of exaggerated trim specifically for this. And I'm going to do my best to show it on cam. This area here is a little close for comfort, so I'm going to a little bit of tape like so. There we go. This way I don't get anything accidentally on the top part of the dash. Read a map. Will I learn? Back and forth, changing lanes. The more things change, the more they stay the same. I'm going nowhere. I'm going nowhere. Since I'm here, I am just afraid that I'm going to lose these little vents. I'm surprised I haven't yet. So I'm going to just install them. They're going to go from the back. And remember, you've added thickness with the paint. So if it doesn't go in, make sure that you just take a X-Acto knife or a small blade and just clean off the perimeter. Gonna give it a small lead in here. It's also very important that you don't use super glue here because super glue will fog everything up. Oh man, look at that. That's awesome. That is awesome. Did want to shift the attention now to the clear pieces that are going to result in the illumination. Now the way this is going to work is run this over sandpaper to get rid of the paint on the high spots. That's all of these, as well as the idiot lights. Or then I'm going to very carefully take some 240 and my trusty sanding block over here, which is just an old printer cartridge. I don't know why this is what I use, but I just think it works perfectly. So we're going to just carefully run it over the top. Be very careful, as you don't want to go crazy and sand down the details entirely. You will be able to run a transparent marker if you want over the needles. Like for example, I'm going to use a touch of orange because the needles are supposed to be orange. However, what you do not want to do is use any kind of white, as whites are usually opaque. The same thing is going to happen here. And again, this is only if you want to exploit the illumination properties of these. You will have to wire in your own LED. Okay, the hard bit is going to be the radio, because the AM/FM slider, actually this might actually be a stereo slider, protrudes above it. So you're either going to want to very carefully get a piece of sandpaper right in there, or depending on what you want to do, I'm going to get an X-Acto knife and just try and scrape it away. Again, I'm new at this here, and I want to make sure I scrape off the black and the silver, because remember, I did shoot this with silver. I think I'm going to get just a little tiny bit in here. Well, actually, that works. This works remarkably well. I still want to paint up the stereo slider. I have gone ahead and killed the lights. I hope you can kind of see how this is looking here. It's a little exaggerated because of the exposure on the camera, but you can see that we are going to have illuminated gauges. My plan was to use green. I just didn't have any on me right here, so I think the white looks quite good. And if you wanted to simply use a green Sharpie or something, you could just paint up the needles in the appropriate color, which actually isn't a bad idea. I may end up doing that. We'll see. I've gone ahead and mixed up some brown paint. What I did here is I also added some thinner because I really need this stuff runny. I don't think I've got enough, but I can always add more. I can't take any out. So the plan is to just get this incredibly fine brush over here and try not to screw this up. Next, we're going to focus on some of the components here that I'd like to have painted black, like the shift boots and the pedals.